All right, ladies and gentlemen, today we are going to go through all of the DQ3 notes. And DQ3, just as a reminder, is how do the interactions of organisms affect their ecosystem. So we're switching our gear kind of back to a more macro. So last DQ was a little bit more micro. We were looking at digestion. Now we're going to be looking at how interactions of organisms between each other can affect the whole ecosystem, the different relationships within that ecosystem, and maybe even how the ecosystem can change the species over time. So we will actually have an entire storyline of evolution, but we're going to start with evolution because having just a general understanding of it is going to be important going forward in this DQ. So evolution is a species changing over time. One thing that you really need to make sure that you're understanding is that it's a species, it's a group of organisms. You are not evolving as an individual person. Nothing out there is. You're born with the traits that you're born with, that you're given. You can maybe adapt your behavior, you can change your behavior, but you can't evolve. You can't develop new attributes during your lifetime. Really, the gist of evolution is a species changing over time, and we're going to talk a little bit about how species change over time. There's actually 5 ways that a group of organisms will change over time, but we're really going to just focus on one of them. And that one thing is going to be probably the most recognized name in biology, which is Charles Darwin. He came up with one of the 5 mechanisms of evolution, and that is called natural selection. But Charles Darwin was a scientist. Basically, he was a naturalist that worked on a ship known as the HMS Beagle. So back, in this time period, in the 1800s, England was sending out a lot of different ships to explore the world. And one of the jobs aboard this ship was to be a naturalist. And along the way, every stop that they would make, the naturalist would get off the boat, collect samples, make drawings, make observations, and bring all that data back to England. So that's what he did. But what is he famous for? So when he went around on this trip around the world, and one of the big areas that he stopped at, and that he in his book attributes to a lot of his theory, is the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos Islands is a group of islands off the west coast of South America, and what makes this island very, very unique is that there's a lot of different islands in very close proximity to one another, but each island has a slightly different environment. It's not like, one's Arctic and one is tropical, but it's more like, one has a lot more vegetation on the ground, where another one might be more sandy and rocky. But what he noticed, so because these islands are in such short proximity are in close proximity to one another, a lot of the animals on each island are very, very similar. So there's, and 2 of the animals that he really studied that kind of get all the press are the Galapagos tortoises and the Galapagos finches. We'll just focus on one of them. Let's take a look at the beaks of the finches here. So what he noticed was that these finches on all these islands were obviously related. They were they looked very similar. You would even, for the untrained eye, may think them to be the same species, but they weren't. So what he noticed was that depending on which island the finch kind of settled on and lived on, the shape of their beak was specifically adapted to eat the type of food that was available on that island. And he wrote all this down in his book and his journals, and took pictures and made drawings, and he brought all that back to England with him. So from this, he started to hypothesize that organisms, if you've got the Galapagos Islands here, I'm just going to draw a bunch of islands. There we go. There's the Galapagos Islands. And you've got this finch, And we actually know today this is going to be the worst finch in the history of finches. It looks more like an airplane, but that's okay. You can deal. There you go. Now it's got tail feathers. Now it's for sure a finch. Here, I'll give it an eye. There you go. So this finch actually migrated here. We actually found the ancestor finch, but it migrated here from South America, and it landed. And when it came, it was all the same species. But this species of finch settled on different islands, and then over time, over thousands of years, natural selection shaped the organisms on the island depending on the food source. Some of these finches might have had bigger beaks. I mean, we all know that even though you have organisms within the same species, we don't all look exactly the same. We have slightly different traits. So maybe some of these finches, remember they're all the same species, but some of these finches may have had larger beaks, while others had smaller beaks. And originally, you know, they all settled on all the different islands, but maybe this island right here, the shells of the nuts on this island were really thick. And in order to get to that food source, they would have to chisel their way through a very hard shell. And the birds with bigger beaks did that better than the birds with smaller beaks. So what probably happened? Well, the birds with smaller beaks really didn't survive here. They either tried to stay and tried to do it and died out, or they just left. They were like, I'm out of here. And then what happened is the birds with the bigger beaks all stayed on this island, which means that they all started reproducing with each other, and the beaks got bigger and thicker and even better adapted to eating that food source. And eventually, the finches that settled on this island became so genetically different, since that they were only breeding with each other and really kind of selecting, there's that natural selection for a larger beak, that they became a different species than the finch on the neighboring island. And maybe the finch on the neighboring island, a small beak was better, because maybe there's lots of little rocky crevices and they have to be able to stick their beak in between the crevices to get to the food source. Maybe there's smaller seeds that fit in there. The large beak birds can't do that. So they all came as one species, but in the end, you have several different species of finch. This is known as adaptive radiation. We'll talk more about that later, but that's what that is. So he didn't develop the theory of evolution. He developed the theory of natural selection. And that is that the theory of natural selection states that you're born basically with the traits that you're born with. And nature chooses, just by being difficult to survive in, nature chooses which trait is going to be best for that environment. And if you have the traits that are going to make you successful in that environment, then you're going to survive. And you're going to pass your traits on to the next generation. If you don't have the traits that are going to help you survive in that environment, then you're not going to survive. And if you don't survive, then you're not going to pass your genes onto the next generation, meaning they will disappear from the population. So mutation can drive this as well. So that's what this kind of part right here is talking about. Mutations are changes in the DNA. They're usually random. Some can be harmful, some can be beneficial. But evolution can happen through mutation. If you have a beneficial mutation, that could, which actually helps them survive, it could actually spread through the whole species of organisms. And then that mutation then becomes a part of that species' genetic code, where the other organisms that don't have those mutations, they disappear. You know, obviously if you have a harmful mutation, I mean, it's just the other side of the coin, you know, they're not going to help you survive, but not only that, they're probably going to make it harder to survive. So they're going to disappear from the population. This example down here is actually a real example. It's called the rock pocket mouse. There's lava flows in the Hawaiian Islands where mice that live on the lava flows are actually darker in color. Same species of mouse, but there's kind of these lava flows that cut through the landscape. mice that live on the lava flows are darker in color than mice that don't. Whereas if you go into the fields, which are literally right next to the lava flows, you can't find any dark mice. It's the lighter mice that you see. And over time, you're going to end up with two different species of mice. You're going to have black mice and lighter mice, just because of the way they blend in. Obviously, the selective pressure, like what's selecting for the color, is going to be the hawk. If it can see it, it's going to eat the first ones it sees, right? So, we'll actually, during our evolution storyline, we'll actually look at that video and that story. So, but we'll come back to that. But hopefully that gives you a general understanding. So a couple highlights. Evolution is a change in species over time, not an individual. There are 5 things that will cause evolution to happen. We're only going to focus on one of those things this unit, and that is called natural selection, where nature chooses what traits are best for the environment just by being hard to live in. If you have those traits, you're going to pass those traits on to the next generation, and those will become more and more prevalent within that species. All right, next we're going to kind of switch gears. We're going to talk about populations and population dynamics. Population dynamics is talking about a change in population over time. There's a couple things that we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about exponential growth and logistic growth. There you go. So let's just talk about populations generally speaking, right? If you have a population of rabbits living in a field, can those rabbits just keep reproducing and grow and grow and grow in number until you get a bazillion rabbits? Well, no. Obviously, there's going to be limits to their population growth. But we see 2 trends in nature. If you don't have limits, we see exponential growth. It just goes up and up and up and up and up and up forever. Now, is this realistic? No. So this is unrealistic. But so why do we bring it up? Well, because we see it. We see it over short periods of time in populations, and it can have a drastic effect. Humans can cause this a lot. If we remove some limit to the population, like for the deer that are living in Illinois, when people started settling here, they started killing wolves. They started killing coyotes. Those are the natural predators of the deer. Well, when you remove that limit, it can become, what can happen is the population can become exponentially increasing. If you look really closely at the logistic growth here, and I just zoom in here, there's the exponential curve right there, right? So it's kind of part of it, okay? Logistic is more realistic because what happens, and what should happen over time, is the population is going to grow. When it's very low, there's lots and lots of resources. So it starts increasing exponentially. Oops. But then it will level out when it gets to what's called the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of organisms that an area can support. So I'll write that in here. Maximum number of organisms an area can support. This is dependent on all the different limiting factors in the environment. So limiting factors could be things like food, space, predators, etc. And carrying capacity isn't a fixed number. It can change. It can go up and down. I mean, think about the amount of food in the summertime versus the amount of food in the wintertime in Illinois. Obviously, the deer in the summer have all kinds of food, where in the winter, that carrying capacity drops, which is also why we see a die-off in deer if we didn't help. And the way we help, of course, is we hunt deer, so we become the natural predators of the deer. But we'll talk more about what happens if you overshoot the carrying capacity a little bit farther down. So carrying capacity is, again, it's kind of this general limit to the population. If the population is below the carrying capacity, you should see an increase in population. If the population is above the carrying capacity, you should see a decrease in population. And this is due, I've been using this word, limiting factors. Limiting factors are anything that will limit the size of a population. You've got a whole bunch of limiting factors over here, right? So you can see starvation, you can see some food, predators, disease, loss of habitat, weather, anything you can think of that would keep a population from growing limitlessly. The carrying capacity is different for each species in the habitat because, again, they're going to have different food sources, they're going to have different requirements. So let's talk about what happens what if you overshoot the carrying capacity? What would happen? Well, I mean, I think everybody understands it goes down, but this is called boom and bust. So if you go over the carrying capacity, the rule of thumb is however far you went over, you will have to drop below the carrying capacity. There's going to be a major die-off. Oop, there's my phone. So there's going to be a major die-off due to lack of resources, due to, you know, who knows, whatever it would be. You know, they might run out of space, so they could become, obviously as population increases, disease can spread faster. All of those things can cause populations to decrease. Now, here's where it becomes really important and where exponential growth comes in. You can see the line I highlighted here is exponential growth, right? If you go into exponential growth, the chances of you overshooting the carrying capacity is actually very high because you're growing so fast that there's a delay between loss of resources and your population. So what can happen is, what if you overshoot by a whole lot, right? If you go way, way above. Well, the rule of thumb is, however far you go over, you got to go under. And if you drop down and hit this x-axis here, well, that's zero. That's zero population. That's extinction, right? So boom and bust can cause extinction events. But that's, of course, only if you go over too high. So that's why we care about this, because it can actually lead to some pretty bad things. So when a single population, so I'm just kind of reading through here, correlates directly with a single limiting factor, is called a boom and bust, okay? As population numbers increase, the resources available to the population decrease. When resources are depleted, the population will decrease, which makes sense. You might want to just write in here, kind of, it's just a rule of thumb. It's not necessarily science, but however above, however, maybe how much, whatever, however above the carrying capacity, you go, you must drop below the carrying capacity. Okay, so just kind of a nice rule of thumb to try to remember. Let's talk about predator-prey relationships. Predators can control populations as well. And prey can actually control predators' populations, and usually they're in sync. There's usually a little bit of a delay. So notice the top line is prey, bottom line is predators. And notice when the prey is low, then the predators start to decrease because there's less and less food. But as the predators start to decrease, that means there's less and less hunting going on, so the prey starts to increase. As the prey starts to increase, then the predators start to increase because there's more and more food. But then eventually you're going to get to a point where there's so many predators that the food starts to dwindle. As the food dwindles, the number of predators start to starve. And it goes like this. So predator-prey relationships go up and down in unison. They both control each other and keep in balance. Okay, that's called homeostasis or equilibrium in the environment. So that's predator-prey relationships. Okay? All right. Moving on to our last section here, symbiosis. So symbiosis is basically interactions between two organisms. So it's where two organisms are interacting. Now, the type of symbiosis is going to depend on the relationship itself. If both organisms are benefiting from the relationship, so both, I know it's bolded, but let's use the highlighter to make it even more important. If both species are benefiting, we call that mutualism. So I'll give you an example, bees and flowers, right? Bees and flowers, bees obviously get nectar from the flowers, and flowers spread their pollen, so they get reproduction using the bees. And there's lots of these examples, and you probably should try to think about maybe coming up with another one and writing it in here. Both species benefiting, okay? Another example would be, we talked about in digestion. We talked about E. coli living in our intestines. E. coli get a nice warm home and a steady supply of food. And E. coli help digest things that we can't digest and give us vitamins. So there's another mutualistic relationship. Commensalism is where one organism benefits and the other organism is not impacted. One organism benefits, the other organism is not impacted. Doesn't care, doesn't even, might not even know the relationship is existing. So the one here is remora and a shark. If you know, the remora is the little pilot fish that swim around with the shark. Now, technically speaking, it depends on the relationship, but the one I'm about to explain to you, so there are some remora that are in a mutualistic relationship with the shark, while other species of remora are 100% a commensalistic relationship. The remora just kind of hangs around the shark. The remora is a bad hunter. Doesn't do very good. It's not a very good predator. So it basically uses the shark to find food. Just kind of hangs around the shark. The shark's a fantastic hunter. And it swims around, it finds its food. The shark eats it, but the shark is a sloppy eater. It rips and tears its food. And the remora gets to eat shark leftovers. So the remora eats shark leftovers. The shark doesn't get anything from this relationship. It ate. The remora didn't impact the shark in any way. The shark wasn't going to eat it anyway. The remora just takes little bits of chunks of meat that get ripped off that the shark was leaving behind anyway. So the remora benefits, the shark is not impacted. Another great example would be like a bird nesting in a tree. I mean, obviously the bird is benefiting from the protection of height, from the protection against predators. The tree's not impacted. The tree's not helped. It's not harmed by the nest in the tree. So that's another example of commensalism. The last example is parasitism. Parasitism is where one organism benefits while the other organism is negatively affected. So one interesting thing is parasites don't really want to kill their host. If they're going to kill their host, we call that predation. That's a little bit different. Then we go back up to the predator-prey relationship, right? Parasitism is different in the fact that the parasite doesn't want the host to die. Because if the host dies, then so does the parasite. So, obviously we deal with mosquitoes in the area, leeches, all of those things are parasites. They're basically feeding off of our resources. Another example we have written here is tapeworm. Not something we really have to deal with much in the United States, but tapeworms live in the intestines of humans. They attach with this kind of hook-shaped mouth into the intestines, and then they just sit there and they just absorb our nutrients as they pass by, giving us less nutrients, and the tapeworm steals it from us. Now, over time, of course, the human can feel sick and the human can feel weakened and maybe they're so sick and so weakened that they get sick from some other virus or some other thing, and maybe they do pass away from the tapeworm. I don't think there's any documented case of that, but maybe. But it wasn't the tapeworm that killed the human. It was, whatever they caught, virus or bacteria or some other issue. So, and that's the end of our notes. What you're going to do now is move on to CSI Wildlife and do that activity. And make sure to turn it in before next time. Thank you very much.